Welcome to Decode Station. I'm Sarah. For centuries, we've been told the same story. The greatest library of the ancient world burned to the ground. And with it, countless secrets of human history disappeared forever. But what if that isn't what actually happened? What if the Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed in one catastrophic night? Today, we're investigating what really happened to the Library of Alexandria.
Yeah, and the historical reality of the library is it's far more complex. And frankly, it's much more unsettling than the dramatic myth we've all been taught.
Right, because we always picture this sudden, fiery doom.
Exactly. But when you look at the actual archaeological and textual evidence, that cinematic image well, it simply does not hold up. The truth forces us to re-examine how human knowledge is actually preserved. And, I mean, more importantly, how it's lost.
Which is exactly the mission for this deep dive, because we really want to peel back the layers of this legend, and examine the documented historical evidence.
Yeah, to see how an institution that was explicitly designed to hold all human knowledge actually vanished.
Right. But to comprehend what was lost, I feel like we first have to understand the staggering scale of the ambition behind it. I mean, the origins of this place go back to Ptolemaic Egypt, right?
Right.
Early 3rd century BCE.
Yes, exactly. And to set the scene for you, you really have to understand who the Ptolemies were.
Right.
So after Alexander the Great died, his empire was carved up by his generals. And a Greek general named Ptolemy took control of Egypt.
Okay.
But because there are Greek outsiders ruling over this, ancient Egyptian civilization, the Ptolemaic dynasty needed a way to legitimize their power.
So they wanted to flex, basically. Prove they were the cultural center.
Precisely. They wanted to prove that Alexandria was the undisputed cultural and intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. So they established this massive research institution called the Maushan.
Wait, the Maushan, that's where you get the modern word museum, right?
It is, yeah. It translates to a temple of the muses,
Yeah.
The Greek goddesses of the arts and sciences. And the library itself was really just one wing, or like one function of this much larger Maushan.
Wow.
And their ambition was entirely unprecedented. The Ptolemaic rulers decided they were going to collect, organize, study, and preserve the entirety of the world's written knowledge.
The entirety.
Every play, every philosophical treatise, every mathematical proof in existence.
See, when I try to picture how they actually accomplished that, the reality is just so much more aggressive than modern libraries.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just waiting for scholars to politely donate their writings. They had this policy for any ship sailing into the harbor of Alexandria.
The ship policy, yes. It's fascinating.
The authorities would literally board the vessel, search the cargo, and if they found any books or scrolls, they'd just seize them.
Right on the spot.
And the state would take your original text, hand it over to their scribes to make a copy on fresh papyrus, and then give you back the copy. They kept the original for the library. It's like, I don't know, a physical, ancient attempt to download the entire internet.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Just grabbing every piece of data floating into their harbor.
Yeah.
It was a state-sponsored, systemic harvesting of information. I mean, if you were a merchant docking in Alexandria, your intellectual property was subject to confiscation. To use your internet analogy, it's as if the government boarded your ship, seized your hard drive, handed you a burned CD copy of your files, and locked your original drive in their vault.
That is wild. They were just sweeping the ancient Mediterranean for data. But, I read somewhere that they amassed hundreds of thousands of scrolls doing this.
Right.
Given how hard it is to verify ancient numbers, how skeptical should we be of that scale?
Oh, you should apply a heavy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
Yeah, the exact number of scrolls in the library remains completely unknown. Ancient historians were notoriously bad at math, and they love to inflate numbers for dramatic effect.
Sure.
Over the centuries, estimates have ranged from 40,000 to 700,000 scrolls.
Wow.
But even if we take the most conservative estimates, the volume of information they were hoarding was physically staggering for the ancient world.
Right. But, stockpiling scrolls is one thing, right? Having a warehouse packed to the ceiling with papyrus is useless if it just sits there gathering dust.
Exactly.
A mountain of scrolls isn't a library. It's just a massive fire hazard. So who are the people actually cracking these scrolls open? What were they doing with all this raw data?
Well, that is where the Maussan truly functioned, as a living intellectual engine. The scholars drawn to Alexandria were given state stipends.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, they were fed, housed, and exempted from taxes so they could do absolutely nothing but think.
The dream.
Right. And they didn't just read, they debated. They translated works from other languages, and they conducted groundbreaking primary research.
So it's like a university campus?
Very much so. We are talking about the brightest minds of antiquity making monumental advancements in mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, literature, textual criticism.
Yeah, and when you look at the specific breakthroughs that happen there, it's just incredible. I mean, Eratosthenes is one of the most famous examples, right?
Yeah.
He calculated the circumference of the Earth with stunning accuracy. But the how of what he did is what always blows my mind.
It's brilliant.
He didn't just guess. He used the data available in the library to pull off this massive geometric experiment.
He did. So Eratosthenes learned that in the city of Syene, which was located far to the south of Alexandria, the sun shone directly down to the bottom of a deep well at noon on the summer solstice.
Meaning it cast absolutely no shadow.
Exactly. No shadow at all. But on that exact same day, at the exact same time in Alexandria, a vertical stick driven into the ground did cast a shadow.
Okay.
And he measured the angle of that shadow and found it to be roughly 7.2 degrees.
Which meant the Earth couldn't be flat, because if it were flat, the sticks in both cities would have identical shadows.
Precisely. And he realized that 7.2 degrees is about 1/50th of a full 360-degree circle.
Right.
So he hired men to physically pace out the distance between Alexandria and Syene. Once he had that distance, he simply multiplied it by 50.
That is just insane to me. Using nothing but shadows, a stick, and pure geometry, he calculated the curvature and circumference of the Earth.
Coming astonishingly close to our modern satellite measurements, I might add.
And that really shows what happens when brilliant minds have the resources to actually apply knowledge. But it does bring up a massive logistical problem.
Oh.
Well, imagine standing in a room with tens of thousands of scrolls. They don't have spines, they don't have titles printed on the outside.
Right, just piles of papyrus.
Yeah, if you pull one out, you have to unroll it and start reading just to figure out what subject it covers. How did anyone like Eratosthenes actually find the specific data they needed?
Well, that logistical nightmare was solved by another brilliant scholar at the library named Callimachus.
Okay.
He recognized that raw, disorganized data is essentially useless. I mean, if you cannot find a text, it might as well not exist.
Totally.
So Callimachus created a monumental work called the Pinnaces.
The Pinnaces. See, this is the part that fascinates me. Before Callimachus, finding a specific scroll must have been like looking for a particular grain of sand on a beach.
Very much so.
He didn't just organize a room, he essentially invented metadata. It's like the first ever search engine algorithm.
That is exactly what he did. The Pinnaces was an enormous 120-volume catalog of the library's holdings. Callimachus divided all human knowledge into core categories. Rhetoric, law, epic poetry, mathematics, medicine, and so on.
And then organized it from there.
Right. Within those categories, he alphabetized the authors. He included brief biographical sketches of each writer. And crucially, and this is genius, to prevent the library from being scammed, he recorded the exact opening line of text for every single scroll.
Because merchants were probably faking famous works to sell them to the Ptolemies for a massive profit.
Exactly.
By logging the first line, Callimachus created a verification system. He built the ancient equivalent of a database index, like the Dewey Decimal System, making the entire ocean of human knowledge actually usable for the first time.
He built the infrastructure of scholarship itself. But, when we look at how brilliantly structured this institution was, how well-funded and culturally dominant it became, we inevitably crash into the massive, unavoidable question of this deep dive.
Right. If it was so brilliantly structured and thriving, how do we arrive at the famous story of Julius Caesar, a massive inferno and all of human history turning to ash in a single night?
Yeah, the Great Fire.
I've seen this referenced in countless books and movies. Where does the story of the Great Fire actually come from?
Well, the popular myth rests heavily on a very real military conflict that occurred in 48 BCE.
Okay.
Julius Caesar found himself entangled in a civil war in Alexandria, barricaded in the royal palace complex alongside Cleopatra.
Right.
The Egyptian fleet was positioned in the harbor, preparing to cut off Caesar's escape and completely blockade his forces. So, as a desperate tactical maneuver, Caesar ordered his men to set fire to his own ships in the harbor.
I want to pause and look at the geography of this, though. Caesar sets fire to the ships in the water. The wind catches the flames, and the fire spreads from the harbor to the docks and into the city.
Yeah.
But the Maushan and the Great Library were located in the Royal District, which is further inland.
Yes.
So if the harbor burned, did the main library actually go up in flames with it? Because it just doesn't seem to make geographic sense.
And your skepticism is entirely justified. It mirrors the consensus of modern historians. The geography just does not support the total destruction of the library during this event.
So what actually burned?
What likely happened is that the fire spread to the dockside warehouses. Those warehouses were heavily utilized for storing grain and, crucially, for storing freshly copied scrolls that were awaiting export or transport up to the main library.
Okay, so a massive shipment of books may have burned, but the institution itself survived.
Precisely.
Why, then, did later writers claim that Caesar destroyed the entirety of ancient knowledge?
It was essentially a centuries-long game of historical telephone. Yeah, a few decades after the event, a Roman writer might mention that 40,000 scrolls burned at the docks. A century later, another historian inflates that number to 400,000.
Oh, wow.
By the time we get to writers like Aulus Gellius, centuries later, the claims that 700,000 scrolls, the entire collection, were reduced to ash. They sensationalized a localized warehouse fire into an apocalyptic cultural tragedy.
Wait, so if scholarship continued as normal, the cinematic movie version of the entire library turning to ash in one night is completely false.
Completely false. We have clear, documented evidence that scholarly activity and the Maushan itself continued to function in Alexandria for centuries after Julius Caesar left Egypt. Modern historians reject the idea that a single fire instantly erased the library.
Okay, so if the smoke clears, Caesar sails back to Rome, and the scholars in Alexandria just walk back into the reading rooms and go back to work, that completely shatters the myth for me.
It really does.
But it presents a much darker puzzle. Because if a sudden, massive fire didn't destroy the Library of Alexandria, it still isn't here today. The real culprit must be something else entirely.
It is. And the historical truth is, in many ways, far more tragic than a cinematic inferno.
Yeah.
The library was not murdered in one dramatic night. It was slowly starved to death over centuries. It suffered an agonizing decline driven by shifting political tides and societal neglect.
When you say starved, you mean the funding dried up. Why would the state stop supporting the crown jewel of their empire?
Because the empire itself changed. The library was entirely dependent on state patronage. Under the early Ptolemies, funding the arts and sciences was a political priority to project cultural supremacy.
Right, the flixing we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But as the centuries wore on, the political landscape shifted drastically. Egypt was absorbed by the Roman Empire. And the Roman emperors in Rome had very different priorities.
They were more pragmatic.
Highly pragmatic. They cared about military dominance, engineering, and administrative control. They were not particularly interested in subsidizing avant-garde Greek poetry or pure mathematics in an Egyptian province.
So the priorities of the state shifted from intellectual dominance to military survival. I mean, it's like a modern institution or university slowly getting its budget slashed year after year until it becomes an empty shell.
That's a very accurate way to look at it.
They stop hiring top-tier scribes to copy the aging papyrus. The roof of the building starts leaking, and there isn't money to fix it. Eventually, the brilliant minds realize there is no money in Alexandria, so they just pack up and migrate to emerging intellectual centers in Rome or Pergamon.
Exactly. It was a gradual bleeding out of talent and resources. Add to that the frequent civil wars, riots, and urban destruction that periodically damaged different quarters of Alexandria over the following centuries. The institution simply hollowed out.
Wow.
But to fully unpack the mythology of its destruction, we also have to address a secondary location in the city, the Serapeum.
Right. I have seen the Serapeum brought up frequently when people argue about when the library fell. What role did this specific building play?
So the Serapeum was a magnificent temple complex in Alexandria dedicated to the god Serapis. More importantly for our deep dive, historical sources suggest it housed a significant collection of books, often referred to as a daughter library to the main Great Library.
Okay.
Fast forward to the year 391 CE. The Roman Empire is undergoing a massive transformation under Christianity, and an imperial decree is issued ordering the closure and dismantling of pagan temples.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, during a violent religious conflict in the city, the Serapeum was stormed and destroyed.
So is this the moment the books finally burned?
Not necessarily. While the temple architecture was undeniably destroyed, historians heavily debate whether any significant number of books were even left inside the Serapeum by 391 CE.
Because it had been neglected for so long.
Exactly. Remember, it had been centuries since the intellectual peak of Alexandria. The destruction of the Serapeum is a deeply tragic chapter in the city's history, but presenting it as the definitive erasure of the Great Library is misleading.
Right.
It was merely the destruction of whatever neglected fragments remained in that specific religious sanctuary.
Which brings up another notorious story. There's a very persistent legend that the final nail in the coffin was the Arab conquest of Alexandria in the 7th century.
Yes.
The story claims that the conquerors found the library and used the millions of scrolls as fuel to heat the city's public bathhouses for 6 months.
Right. And I have to firmly dismiss that. That story completely collapses under historical scrutiny. Modern historians universally reject it.
So where does it come from?
What you are looking at is a piece of political propaganda that was invented centuries after the alleged event. The story first appears in texts written in the 13th century.
Oh, wow. Way later.
Way later. By the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century, the original Great Library, the Maushon, and the Serapeum were already long gone. There were no mountains of scrolls left to burn.
Okay, so if we clear away the myth of Caesar's Great Fire, and we clear away the myth of the 7th century bathhouse fires, we are just left with this slow, quiet fade into obscurity.
We are.
Which forces us to reevaluate the core tragedy. I mean, we always hear about all the incredible ancient technology and science we lost because of Alexandria. What was actually lost in those specific buildings?
Well, that requires a very careful, nuanced answer. The reality is, we simply cannot know exactly which unique, irreplaceable works disappeared solely with the library.
Right.
We know that an immense amount of ancient literature is lost to us. Entire cycles of Greek epic poetry, treatises by early philosophers, lost plays by Sophocles, but we must be incredibly careful with our assumptions.
Meaning, we can't just point to Alexandria and blame it for every missing piece of antiquity. Like, not every lost ancient invention or scientific discovery disappeared because of Alexandria.
Precisely. It is a crucial caveat. You cannot claim that everything disappeared because the library fell. The ancient Mediterranean world was vast. There were other libraries.
Yeah.
The true bottleneck for ancient knowledge wasn't a single fire. It was the brutal mechanics of how texts physically survived from antiquity to the modern day.
Right, because ancient texts weren't sitting on a decentralized global server farm. We were talking about papyrus.
Yes, very fragile material.
And for those who don't know, papyrus is essentially the pith of a river weed pressed together and dried in the sun. It is highly vulnerable to humidity, mold, and insects. And Alexandria is a humid coastal city.
Exactly. A papyrus scroll has a finite lifespan. It will degrade and crumble within a century or two unless it is actively cared for. In the ancient world, a book only survived if a human being physically sat down and copied it by hand onto fresh material.
Which takes a lot of time.
It was an expensive, exhausting process.
So if a specific scientific treatise isn't deemed popular or important enough by the culture of the time, no one pays a scribe to copy it.
Right.
The papyrus rots, and that knowledge simply winks out of existence.
That is the chilling reality of ancient survival. Texts vanished for a multitude of reasons. Localized wars and fires certainly played a role, of course, but far more often, texts were lost to simple, quiet neglect. Changing societal interests meant that people just didn't think certain works were worth the immense time and money required to preserve them.
You know, it is a much heavier realization than the myth.
It really is.
You think about the staggering ambition we started with, the Ptolemaic rulers seizing books off ships, Callimachus inventing metadata to organize 500,000 scrolls, Eratosthenes proving the curvature of the earth.
Yeah.
And in the end, it wasn't erased by a cinematic villain with a torch. The funding just dried up, the roof leaked, the papyrus molded. A generation simply decided that preserving the knowledge of the past wasn't a priority anymore.
It shifts the entire perspective. The great mystery here isn't who burned the Library of Alexandria. We spend so much time looking for a scapegoat. But a much better, much more terrifying question is, how does an institution this great brute simply disappear?
Right.
The evidence shows us its fate was shaped by a combination of centuries of smaller fires, shifting political landscapes, declining financial support, and the natural, unavoidable fragility of written knowledge.
So why does this specific library still hold such incredible power in our collective imagination? I mean, if the real story is just about budget cuts, shifting politics, and rotting paper, why do we still mourn it?
Because Alexandria has become history's greatest symbol. It represents a profound dual reality of human nature.
What do you mean?
Well, on one hand, it stands for our most beautiful ambition, the desire to collect everything we know, to understand the universe, and to map our place within it. On the other hand, it perfectly embodies our deepest, most primal fear.
The fear that progress is not a straight line.
Exactly. The fear that knowledge is not permanent and that we can easily slide backward into the dark.
Wow.
It makes you wonder about our modern digital age, actually. If you think about it, we believe the cloud is permanent, but digital formats become obsolete rapidly. Our massive server farms require immense amounts of physical electricity and cooling to maintain the data.
That's true.
If the funding for those server farms stopped tomorrow, or the infrastructure fractured, our modern Great Library would vanish much faster than papyrus ever did. A digital dark age is entirely possible.
That is a haunting parallel. The truth of Alexandria is less cinematic than the legend of one enormous fire, but it is far more disturbing. Because perhaps the most frightening way to lose knowledge is not through one enormous fire, but slowly when people stop preserving it. Stay curious. Stay skeptical.